Part of creating a beautiful grade is knowing your tools. And a big part of knowing your tools is knowing your software. So today I'm going to show you not only the resolve settings that pros and Hollywood colorists use that you may not be using, but everything in Resolve's project settings that you need to understand when you're working in the color page. All right, let's dive in and take a look at Resolve's project settings. So I'm going to access my project settings by hitting Shift-9. I could also access them by hitting this little gear icon at the lower right, or by going to File menu and hitting Project Settings here. And what we're going to do is start up here at the very top at our master settings and work our way through all of these sections to get a handle on what we do in these project settings and how it influences what we do when we're grading. So let's start here with our master settings. First up, we've got our timeline format here. Most important thing here is this timeline resolution. This is where you are going to define the canvas that you are grading on. Now, this may not match the resolution of your source media, but it should match or exceed the resolution of your highest quality, highest resolution deliverable. So say, for example, that you need to deliver something in UHD, 3840 by 2160, just like I've got right here. You would not want to set your timeline resolution any lower than that resolution that your highest resolution deliverable calls for, okay? Now, with that said, temporarily, while you're grading, if you want to drop this down in order to get better performance, you can do that. But even if you're going to do that, even if you're going to temporarily drop things down, you first want to make sure that you are going back to full resolution before you go over to your deliver page to render it out. And you also want to make sure that your aspect ratio is matching. Quick shortcut for that is just to break out your calculator. And if you're not sure that your aspect ratios are the same, start with your mastering resolution, 3840 divided by 2160. That's a 1.77. That's a 16:9 aspect ratio, right? If you're saying, oh, I want to get some better performance, I'm going to drop this down to a lower resolution, but I'm not sure off the top of my head if 1920 by 1080 is the same aspect ratio as 3840 by 2160. Well, you can go back over to your calculator and do that same thing. 1920 divided by 1080, we get the same number, therefore we have the same aspect ratio. So you can temporarily drop this down if you need to, but even if you do, make sure that you are using a lower resolution of the same aspect ratio, and don't forget to flip it back to the full resolution before you go to deliver. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a lower quality result because you're essentially scaling things down and then scaling them back out, or back up rather, when you do your output, okay? Other than that, here within this timeline format section, we have our pixel aspect ratio. This is virtually always going to be square. It's very rare that you would have a non-square timeline pixel aspect ratio. For individual clips, you may have a non-square pixel aspect ratio. That's much more common, but here, this is almost always going to want to be square. Use vertical resolution. That's simply going to swip things around from being 1920 by 1080 to being 1080 by 1920 if you're needing to create something with more of a portrait orientation. So I'm going to leave this at its default for now. And here with our frame rate, these things are going to be defined when our timeline is initially built or conformed and isn't something we need to worry about, though it's helpful to remember that if you're seeing a mismatch between this and this, that's probably a mistake. Again, very rare that you would have a mismatch between here and here, your playback versus your timeline frame rate. Okay, let's talk about our video monitoring for a second. So, video monitoring, first of all, what does this control? What does this determine? The only thing that this is going to have an impact on is the signal that you are sending to your reference monitor or to your client monitor from a dedicated input-output box or card. Okay, so that would be something like a Blackmagic Ultra Studio or a DeckLink card, something like that. If you're just connecting up an HDMI or a DisplayPort output from your computer directly and sending it out to a screen, you don't need to worry about this. It's going to have no impact on your workflow at all. So this is only in the case of using a reference monitor or client monitor connected to a dedicated breakout box or card. And because this is going to vary depending on what monitor you're using and even what breakout box or card you're using, I can't tell you exactly how you should configure all of these settings. It's going to depend on your setup. You can see how I've got mine set up based on what my reference monitor here and my client monitor over on the far side of the room need. But again, this may vary depending on what you're doing. The two constants, the things that are not going to change, are these first two options here. This should virtually always match your timeline resolution up here, which I'm going to go ahead and flip back up to UHD. And your frame rate or your format here should also match your playback frame rate and timeline frame rate. These should really all be the same thing in the vast majority of cases, okay? Let's talk about the optimize media and render cache section here. So for me, these first 4 dropdowns are largely irrelevant. I don't recommend using proxies when you're color grading. You really want to be touching the native camera original source whenever possible and not proxies that might be being generated on the fly. So I am not going to be generating proxies in any workflow that I do inside of Resolve. Similarly, optimized media, this is not a workflow that I use or have ever used in Resolve. I've never had a use for it. So this is not something that I can speak to directly. I can tell you these defaults are sensible enough if you're wanting to optimize your media. If you have high quality material and for whatever reason you do want to create optimized media, then you could use something like ProRes 444 HQ or XQ, I should say, or an uncompressed format. However, these formats here are most likely going to be just as large, probably larger than whatever camera format you're working with, even if it's RAW. So you'll get all of your quality preserved here, but you're actually going to get just as heavy of a file as your original file is. So that's kind of some guidance there. Render cache format, however, this one I use all the time. So essentially, anytime we get to a point in our timeline where we've got heavy enough media or heavy enough grading that we're applying to that media that we cannot get real-time playback, this is where our render cache comes into play. And there are different ways to cache off our media when we need to do so. But for my workflow, I'm going to be caching things off all the way at the end of the chain after the image has already been converted for display. So for me, that makes ProRes 422 HQ a perfectly suitable choice. If you're caching things while they're still in a log or a working space state like DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, as opposed to at the very end of your node tree, you might want to flip this over to ProRes Quad 4 XQ or even uncompressed 16-bit float. Make sure, however, especially if you go into one of these uncompressed options, that you are connected to a cache drive that has enough speed that it can actually push and pull that media in real time. Otherwise, you're going to have a render cache that also won't play in real time. That kind of defeats the purpose of a render cache, right? So that's the deal with your render cache format. Enable background caching, that just designates how long Resolve should wait before it begins caching in the background when you're inactive with your keyboard, mouse, or control surface. You could look at automatically caching your transitions or composites here as needed. I typically leave these unchecked and don't notice any problems with that. And we're going to leave the fusion effects caching at its default here. Not really relevant to our discussion because we're talking, of course, about the color page today. Down here in our working folders, this is another one that's highly relevant. We want to make sure, especially for our cache, that we are writing our cache to and reading our cache from a dedicated scratch drive that ideally is fast and ideally is not being used for anything else. So it's not storing project media. It's not an internal drive internal to whatever workstation you're operating on. It's its own scratch drive that you can read and write from. And as a result, it doesn't have to share bandwidth with any other resources that are in play for your particular project. So for me, I'm pointing it to a scratch drive that I have set up on this system. And my gallery stills are pointing to the same place. So they're going to this dedicated scratch drive. And this is a fixed location that no matter what project I'm working in, I can always push things to that location. And that drive is permanently mounted on this system, which I would recommend as well. Okay, let's talk about our frame interpolation. Not much to say here. This again is going to be more of a editorial or a conform concern than it is a color concern. So when you're initially building out or conforming your timeline, or even if you're doing a full online and finish and you're getting past the point of a color grade and you're looking at creating final deliverables and doing your onlining, this is where these variables would come into play. And you may want to adjust them to get the results you're after. But for the sake of our conversation about color grading, these are mostly not relevant. Okay, let's take a look at our image scaling here. All right, so image scaling, we really just have a couple of things that we're doing here. First up, in this image scaling section, we are defining the filter that's being used to resize our image. We get kind of spoiled, at least I get kind of spoiled in software like Resolve, where we're dynamically scaling and resizing things all the time. And it seems like such a simple sort of like turnkey operation. But the reality is scaling stuff up or down, there's actually a lot of different ways to do it, a lot of different filters or schemes that we can use for it that will produce subtly or even significantly different results depending on what we choose. I've got mine set here to the default. So my resize filter is set to sharper and my deinterlace quality is set to normal. This is not going to come into play unless you're working with interlaced footage. That's typically going to be archival footage, older footage, right? But for me, I'm going to leave my resize filter at sharper, deinterlace at normal. If you want to experiment with your resize filter, especially if you're doing a project with a lot of resizing and with a lot of large resizing where you're going from, say, standard definition up to high definition or even UHD, this might be something that you want to play around with and see if you can get a better looking result to your eye with these different options. But I typically leave this at its default of sharper. Now let's talk about our scaling. So we've got two different sets of scaling. We've got our input scaling and we've got our output scaling. Our input scaling is going to determine how our source media is placed into the canvas that we have defined up here in our timeline resolution. So right now I've got that set to scale full frame with crop. That means I want to fill the entire canvas, even if that means I need to crop some things off left and right or top and bottom. Let's compare that to the other most common option that I would use in this scenario, which would be scale entire image to fit. Scale entire image to fit, we're going to audition by using a really cool shortcut that I like of holding down Option and hitting Save. And when I do that, I'm still in my project settings. I don't have to go back to them, but I've updated what's happening down below in the actual color page. And you can see when I've done that, I'm now scaling the entire image, every single pixel of that original image, and I'm simply padding top and bottom to preserve the original aspect ratio of the image. The reason I don't do this as much is because if I've selected the right timeline resolution here, then I don't want to have built-in letterboxing or pillar boxing when I scale my image into that canvas. I am either going to have an instance where I don't need to pad or letterbox or pillar box things at all, or I'm going to need to crop things off left and right or top and bottom in order to fill that canvas, which is of course the entire premise of the canvas. We really want to think of this timeline resolution that we define here as being active image area, not just the standard that we are delivering for. And this leads me right to the output scaling aspect of things, because 9 times out of 10, match timeline settings is the way you're going to want to go. You're going to have a canvas defined here, and you're simply going to match that here. But there are other situations that can come up. So let's do this real fast. I'm going to set my scale full frame with crop back on here. And let's say I want to master at 3840 wide, 3840 pixels wide, but instead of a height of 2160, I want to have the effective height that will give me a 2.39 aspect ratio. So let's once again break out my calculator and do some math here. And let's say we're going to do 3840 divided by 2.39. What vertical height do I need to have in order to get an effective 2.39? That's going to be 1606. So let's say I want that to be my active image area, as I mentioned a moment ago. In this scenario, I would make this change here, and I would go ahead and save it. And I'm also going to go to my image scaling here and say, don't match timeline settings, set my output resolution, in this case, to match this here in my video monitoring. What are you actually monitoring this on? In the case of a reference monitor like this one, that's most commonly going to be a 16:9 display. So this is how my monitoring is set up here, and it's what my delivery format is as well, 3840 by 2160, because we typically wouldn't deliver in a resolution like this one. So I'm setting this up as kind of the odd man out. Everything else is set to UHD, and you can see when I hold down Option and click Save, now I have letterboxing to accommodate my active image area within a 3840 by 2160 canvas. So that's a bit more of an edge case, but it does come up often enough that I felt like I wanted to share it with you guys. For now, we're going to go back to a vanilla setup, match timeline settings, go back to 3840 by 2160 here, okay? And that's all we need to look at for our image scaling, okay? If we wanted to turn this off and look at these other options, we talked about pixel aspect ratio for your timeline. Same thing here. You're virtually always going to want to have a square pixel aspect ratio. You're not going to want to do CinemaScope here. And for your mismatched resolution files, scale entire image to fit is really going to be the only sensible option in that one edge case that we just explored of wanting to introduce some padding either left and right or top and bottom in order to fit your canvas into your actual output resolution. Okay. And then your super scale, this is something that is going to improve big changes in the way that you're scaling your image. Typically, this is something you're going to want to leave at none, and you're going to want to solve your scaling issues elsewhere in your pipeline. here is really not the place for there to be a big gap between the overall resolution of this output versus your timeline resolution. You can see in this case, it's the same width. I'm just adding some top and bottom padding, some black area essentially in this setup that we were exploring a moment ago. But I wouldn't, for example, set my timeline resolution to 1920 by 1080 and then set my output scaling to 3840 by 2160. There'd be no reason to do that. That would kind of go against the first point that we made of making sure that this timeline resolution reflects what we actually want our output, highest quality, highest resolution deliverable to be. Okay, so let's set this back to match timeline settings and keep on going here. Let's go to color management. I've spent probably the most time on this section of any of the project settings, at least here on YouTube. And spoiler alert, we're not going to do a deep dive on our color management settings here in this video because it would take too long. That's its own video. We've actually done that video before on the channel. So if you want to brush up on setting up your color management in your project settings, we've got a dedicated video for that here on the channel. For today, I'm going to leave my color science at the default I usually do of DaVinci YRGB. And I just want to call out what is significant here. What is the function of the timeline color space and the output color space? Because when we have our color science set to DaVinci YRGB, these things are not color managing our image directly. So just as an easy example, let's flip from DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, which is my true actual working color space, to something dead wrong, Aces. Aces is like the furthest from what I'm actually grading in here because this is a linear space with a much larger gamut, has no resemblance to the actual working space I'm using. Let's see what happens when I hold down Option and hit Save here. Nothing at all, right? Because these settings are not color managing my image whatsoever. They are passing metadata tags that are being used in other areas of Resolve, including the HDR zones palette and including the deliver page when we go to deliver and we are encoding metadata about the color space of our asset into that file. So these things are important to tag correctly, but they are not going to directly influence the rendering of your image once you hit save. Okay? Okay, Dolby Vision, HDR10+, HDR Vivid. These are things that, again, are a bit beyond scope for our discussion today, but these are all aimed at how we are going to produce our HDR, or rather our SDR deliverables when we are doing an HDR master. These are proprietary systems for deriving multiple deliverables in an HDR delivery scenario. So a bit out of scope for today. HDR10+ is very much an edge case. I haven't done any work in HDR10+ in a number of years. Dolby Vision, that would be worth doing a deep dive on. We could do a dedicated video on Dolby Vision at some point in the future. For now, I'll just point out that once you enable Dolby Vision and you hit save, the Dolby Vision palette appears down here in the actual color page, and you have the ability to now use the Dolby Vision system to trim your SDR pass from your HDR master. But beyond that, it's a bit past scope for what we want to cover today in terms of our project settings. I'm going to turn this off for now. I'll leave these things off for now. And let's talk about our lookup tables for a second. So this set of dropdowns essentially allows us to drop any of our lookup tables that are in our LUT library at various points in our imaging pipeline. So we could do one right at the very head of the imaging pipeline by hitting input. We could do one right at the output, and this is going to control what gets rendered. This is going to control what goes to our monitor. It's going to control what we see on our scopes. It's going to alter that signal to all of those places. Video monitor lookup table is only going to alter the signal that goes down the wire from our breakout box or card to our reference monitor, okay? Color viewer lookup table, you can see I'm actually doing something here. I'm using my macOS viewing transform here to change the way that this image here feels inside of my GUI to get a more accurate rendering, to get a better match between this and what I'm seeing over here on my reference monitor, okay? So that's the only one that I'm using here. If you want to know more about this macOS viewing transform that I'm using, we've got a dedicated video on that as well. You can go check it out. This macOS viewing transform itself is a free download if you're interested in checking it out. But for now, I'm just going to leave it at saying in my default project settings, which we'll talk more about in just a couple minutes here, I do have this slotted in simply so that there's not as much of a gap between what I'm seeing on my GUI monitor versus what I'm seeing over here on my reference monitor, okay? Scopes lookup table, that's fairly self-explanatory. That is going to apply the LUT to the signal that is being read into our scopes here. So if you want to just change the way things are being scoped, this would be the lookup table drop-down menu for you. And you can see by default, it's simply following whatever we selected under video monitor lookup table, which at the moment is nothing at all. Last one, but not least, in fact, most important. What's the opposite of least? Most. This 3D lookup table interpolation drop-down menu here, in Resolve, this defaults to trilinear. Trilinear is an interpolation scheme that no one should use ever in a modern color grading environment. Tetrahedral is superior in every way, and it's the one that you want to go with. In some cases, you will notice no difference in terms of the way a LUT applied to an image in trilinear versus tetrahedral looks, but in many cases, you will notice artifacts or unsmooth things or kind of like broken things in your image when you have trilinear selected, and they will smooth right out as soon as you flip over to tetrahedral. So this is a great thing, again, to save into your default project settings that we're going to talk about more in just a minute here. So tetrahedral, that's a big one. This is a really important one that you want to make sure you've got set to the proper position. You can also update all of your LUTs here. If you've, for example, added new LUTs into your LUT folder and you don't want to have to relaunch Resolve, you can do that from within here. And you can even open your LUT folder directly from within Resolve if you want to see the contents of that folder without having to manually navigate to it within your Finder or your File Explorer. Okay? All right, let's talk about broadcast safe. Spoiler alert, I have never once turned this on in my entire career. Nobody come for me. It's okay. If you turn it on, that's okay. You've probably got good reason for turning it on and you probably use it for something. Here's my feeling. I want to have full control over the image that goes out to my display. I'm already color managing, so it's not like I'm going total cowboy on the image as it is. It's being managed and piped out to the display properly to begin with. And I can't recall a single instance in my career where I have had a broadcast safe excursion that I needed to go in and solve when I was using a proper color managed workflow. So this to me just seems overkill and unnecessary. And I always have it turned off. I encourage you to do the same. I challenge anyone who says, oh no, you need to turn that on, to actually show me an example of a sound pipeline where you need to turn this on because it's going to somehow constrain you or make your image legal in a way that it wasn't already. Okay, thanks for coming to my TED Talk about broadcast safe. Okay, let's talk about our general options here. Probably of all of these sections that we are going to look at, the general options have the most relevant stuff to us as colorists, and there's some plot twists and some confusing things in here that I'm going to try to break down for you. So first up, we've got our conform options here. As the name implies, conform options are more about your timeline when you're initially building or conforming it. These can be really great if you're having difficulty conforming an AAF or an XML or an EDL that you've received from an editor using another system. If you find the right combination of settings here, you can often get an easier time of initially reading in that XML correctly and fully with no media offline. But in terms of working in the color page, this is not directly relevant, so I'm going to skip over it. And honestly, we could start a whole channel on conform. Forget a video. We could do a whole YouTube video on conform, which I'm all for as long as I don't have to do it, because conform is quite difficult even today in 2024. Anyway, let's talk about the color options that we have here. These options are very relevant to what we do, as the name implies. So we've got some options for the way that we label our gallery stills when we grab stills and stick them up here in our gallery. I don't use these to automatically label the stills using the clip name or any of these other options that I have available, or to append still numbers. But these can be great options if you want to, if you do a lot of mass exporting of stills, or if you simply need more labeling or organization of your stills and you save off like large groups of stills within a given project. For me, I don't work in enough volume, I suppose, to feel like I need that extra data or to feel like there's a benefit from it. But this is something you can definitely experiment with and find your own conclusions on. Different colorists use this in different ways, and some use it as an integral part of keeping their sanity, keeping themselves organized as they're grabbing stills in the course of a larger project or maybe a TV series or something like that. Okay, this next one, luminance mixer defaults to 0. This one is a big one. So I want to show you what this one means in like a hands-on format. Let's turn this off for now, and I'm going to save for just a second. And I'm also going to go into this image here, and I'm going to balance out my image using my go-to technique for balancing, which we've also talked about here on the channel. That's to flip the gamma of my balance node into linear and to push my gain in whatever direction I want to see things go. Now watch what happens. Let's say I want to go for like a really aggressive, like washed, warm look in this image. Look at what is happening to that fire. That looks absolutely insane. To be honest, it looks so insane that it kind of looks cool. And I feel like in the right movie, I could actually get behind this vibe. But we're certainly clipping stuff out. We're certainly losing detail. This is certainly not a sort of like conservative reproduction of that detail, right? Now, check out the fix for this. So if we go off and then on, that's happening as a result of my balancing operation here. But really why it's happening is because of this little guy right here, luminance mix. If I drop this down to 0, watch what happens. Instantly cleans itself up. Now, we talk about why this happens in another video and kind of break it down in a little bit more detail. But for today, let's just suffice it to say, because of this and because of other reasons, I don't like to have my luminance mix on at all by default. I indeed want my luminance mix to default to 0. And that's exactly what this setting allows us to do. So if I check this box and I hold Option and hit Save, I'm going to get a luminance mix that's defaulted to 0 in this image. Well, I may actually need to kind of like do a fresh grade from scratch or a fresh node in order for that. Yeah, check this out. So if I paste this adjustment onto a new node and I just paste my primaries like so, and then I flip this into linear. Now I'm going to get, well, it's also pasting my luminance mix. I am realizing. So I needed to have this setting in place before I created the node. But once it is in place, my luminance mix will default to this value of 0, which is going to ensure that, among other things, I don't get this nasty artifacty reproduction, which, like I said, now I kind of feel like I want to take it as a challenge to like go do a grade and like make that work, make that like hard clipped, like, almost like apocalyptic rendering of the fire actually work for a narrative reason. But I digress. Let's go back to the project settings. All right, so luminance mixer defaults to 0. Use legacy log grading ranges and curve. This is the first of a family of options that I'm going to try to briefly explain for you, but I'm going to preface by saying, don't worry about it. It's really not relevant to learning or using the color page in 2024. This is for using a different type of log control that was available like many, many versions of Resolve ago. So if you were grading Resolve and back in like, I don't know, 2010, 2011, 2012, somewhere around there, and you really got used to using your log controls in a particular kind of way, you might want to turn this on. Other than that, you can safely turn it off. And the even better advice would be to avoid using the log wheels altogether. They're not really the best way of getting a smooth adjustment to your image. Okay, so you can leave that off by default. Use S-curve for contrast. This is another really important one. So check this out. Let's look what happens if we have this turned off for a minute. I'm going to turn this off. And what I'm going to do is use my grayscale ramp DCTL. This is a free download I will link to in the description for the video as well. And if I do a new serial node downstream of this and I look at the curve graph that I'm now seeing in my waveform, I'm also going to temporarily turn off my output transform in my color management. And I'm even going to turn off my look that I have happening here from my look development plugin Contour. So what we're starting with is just a pure linear grayscale ramp that we're seeing here on the bottom of the frame, right? And I've got that represented here in my waveform. Now check this out. Let's do some contrast pivot. So we're going to increase our contrast like so. What's happening? Well, we're increasing the slope of this ramp, but what's happening at the bottom and the top? We're just hard clipping stuff out, right? Things that were in bounds before are now being pushed through the ceiling and down through the floor of the container, right? That's where this setting comes in. Watch how this curve changes when I check this box and save. Look at that. I've still got the same slope in the middle, but I've got compression now happening in the top and bottom so that I'm not hard clipping things out. You could think of this as soft clipping or compressing things at the top and bottom. This is something for you to decide your preference on as an individual colorist. I actually prefer to have this turned off. Reason being, I have so many instances of compression and roll in my imaging pipeline, namely from my look that I'm going to be putting here and my output transform here. Those both have a lot of roll to them. So I actually like having a linear operator upstream so that if I need to push something down to the floor, I can really do it and it's not going to compress or resist me at all. But that's my personal preference. You'll have to experiment with both and see which you prefer. But that's what this setting is all about. This is a huge one. This is really going to change the behavior of your contrast pivot tool depending on whether it's turned off or on. Okay, Let's take a look what else we've got. Stereoscopic conversion. We're going to skip over that one. If you're not doing stereoscopic mastering, then it really is not going to be relevant to what you're doing. If you are doing stereoscopic mastering, then you will very quickly figure out that this is helpful and you might want to turn it on. But for now, we're going to leave that. We're going to kind of skim past that one because it's such an edge case. Local version for new clips in timeline. This is slightly less of an edge case. This one matters. If you've never used remote or local versions in Resolve, that's another topic that we could do an entire deep dive, an entire video on. I love using remote versions in Resolve, which basically says any instance of a original clip, no matter how many times it appears in the timeline, no matter how many timelines it appears in, if I adjust the grade in one instance, it will adjust everywhere else it appears in that timeline, and it will adjust everywhere else it appears in the other timelines. It's very handy, especially for a first color grading pass where you're wanting to set a common foundation for everything. This control is simply saying, when I add a new clip to the timeline, should that be defaulted to being a remote version, meaning it is going to observe the grade that was already set for other instances of that clip elsewhere in the timeline or in other timelines? Or is it going to default to being its own local version that's going to receive its own grade that won't be influenced by or influence any other instances of that same shot? Okay. Save timeline thumbnails with project. Typically, you don't want to leave that turned off because it's going to really increase your load time and it's not necessary. You can have your thumbnails kind of populate when you load up the project for the first time. Use BGR pixel order for DPX V2. That's a deep cut as well. If you've got the right kind of DPX files and you need to use the BGR pixel order, you're probably going to know it pretty soon. So I'm going to skip over this for now and say this is relevant really only to particular DPX assets that you're working with. So unless you're working with DPX assets and you're seeing a problem with the rendering of your colors when the image comes in, don't worry about this box, leave it unchecked. Embed timecode and audio output. That one's fairly self-explanatory and also quite a bit of an edge case in terms of when we need to push metadata down the wire in whatever audio signal we are outputting to our audio monitors. You can safely leave that one off as well unless you've got specific reason to turn it on. Let's talk about node stack layers. This is a new option that is a result of Resolve 19, where we now have the ability, if I set this to 3, I now have these different sections of my node stack that are labeled right now, default, clip L1, L2, L3. And this simply allows me to decide as a default how many layers, how many different sections of my node tree am I going to have when I am working within this project. And you can even label these. So you could say this might be my primaries, secondaries, and trims, something like that. This is what this is here for. Super useful to know about. It's a great new feature inside of Resolve 19 that, once again, we could do a dedicated video on. I feel like we're like programming out the next year of YouTube content just with the ideas that are bubbling to the surface with Resolve's project settings. Who knew Resolve project settings were so fascinating? Anyway, I'm going to set this back to its default. Dynamics profile. This has to do with your keyframing. When you're setting keyframes inside of the color page, these can safely stay at their defaults. Even if you're wanting to feather or ease particular keyframes, I've never found the need to change these values here. I simply change them in the particular instance where I need to. But you could do a deep dive on this and you could explore and say, hey, there's some magical different set of values that I prefer to set these at that get me a more eased type of keyframe transition that is more often the behavior that I'm looking for than the defaults that I'm seeing here. I've simply never experienced that. Lastly, our versions. This is, again, not something you're going to encounter every day, but definitely something you want to know about. So for your versions here, you can come up with basically a short list of names that you can invoke when you are creating or modifying your versions of your grades here inside of the color page. So what happens here by default is when I go to my versions and I say I want to create a new version, it's going to ask me for a version name, and right now I just have to input that from scratch. If I want to have a short list that I can pull this from, I could go back into my project settings and say, this is my first pass, second pass, client notes, whatever different versions I might want to create, and then I'm just going to go ahead and save this. Interestingly enough, it wouldn't let me save just when I adjust here. I actually needed to just flip some other setting. So I just turned this off and then back on. Now I can save. And now if I go to create a new version, I should be able to choose from my first pass, second pass client notes. So if you have versions that you typically like to use the similar naming scheme for project after project or within a particular project, this can be a nice time saver. So you don't have to type that in every single time. Okay. Let's go back to our project settings and see what else we got. That's our general options. All right, let's go to our camera raw. We've talked about our camera raw before here on the channel, but this is a great opportunity to recap something that I used to find so confusing, and I think a lot of us find really confusing about the camera raw controls. This raw profile drop-down menu here, this is not designating what raw profile you want to use when you are importing raw media into your project. You're not choosing something here. The only thing you are choosing is which raw profile you want to tune the input parameters for. So just as an easy example here, if I set my Blackmagic Raw color space input to something zany, ACES AP0, ST2084 PQ with highlight recovery turned on, and I save that, and I now go back to my airy stuff and I do some stuff here and say decode using project and set my lift like so, and I save that, when I go back to my Blackmagic Raw, the same zany settings that I did a moment ago are persisting. So this is just a way of organizing a whole host of settings that are all in play, even if we're not looking at them all at the same time. We are not selecting which raw profile to use. We are selecting which raw profile we want to tune the input behaviors for, the decoding behaviors for here in our project settings, okay? So with that said, all that we're doing here is exactly that. We're simply going to go in and decide, how do we want to decode Airy Raw? How do we want to decode Blackmagic Raw? How do we want to decode Cinema DNG, Red, whatever it might be? And this is going to depend on your workflow and on the relevant cameras that you're actually using. So again, no need to deep dive on every single one of these raw profiles. We're going long enough with this video today, but that's what these are here for. It's to allow you to tune the way each of these raw formats is decoded, not designed to force you to choose which profile you want to use for this project. Okay. All right. So let's now look at our capture and playback. This one's easy. I'm going to make your life really, really simple. You don't need to worry about capture and playback if you are color grading in any sort of traditional sense in 2024. If there's not a tape deck involved in your workflow, if there's not some sort of like capture of a live stream involved in your workflow, you don't need to worry about this at all. It's going to have no impact, no influence on anything that you do. So we can skip right past it. Subtitles and transcription, that may have an impact if you're doing full-on finishing and final deliverables from within Resolve, but that's quite out of scope in terms of working within the color page in Resolve. So we're going to skip past that as well. And same thing all the way through. Fairlight, path mapping. This one can come into play if we are wanting to designate our sort of like go-to paths for our initial project media. But in general, this is not something that I have populated, something that I just leave at its default value. And then our Blackmagic Cloud values, this are going to be particular to projects that are stored in the cloud, in the Blackmagic Cloud project server, which the one we're working in right now happens to be, but this is not going to directly influence the way that you're grading. The only thing I'll call out here is if you are doing a Blackmagic Cloud project, go into your project settings and make sure that your media files are set to don't sync media, like so, because that should really be your default. You don't want to be syncing media unless you're doing so intentionally and explicitly. Okay. Okay. That was like the best lightning round through the project settings that I can take you through, the best overview that I can give you. And I hope we've gotten two things out of this that, again, we talked about it at the start of this conversation today. A, there's some gems hiding in here. That luminance mixer defaults to 0 thing, that's huge, because if you don't have that, you end up with situations where you are, let's turn this output transform back on. You end up with situations where you end up having to babysit and like make sure that you turn that luminance mix down to 0 every single time there might be a potential issue with it. When you have that luminance mixer defaulted to 0, you don't even have to worry about it. That one's huge. That S-curve for contrast thing, that's huge. The node stack layers thing that's new in Resolve 19, that one's huge. So there's a very significant set of variables that we can alter in our project settings that are going to set you up for success and set you up for efficiency when you're grading that you really want to be mindful of. And the second thing that I really hope we've done is declutter and demystify what all of this stuff means. Not all of it's relevant to color grading, but even to know what is and what isn't, and then to know roughly what the things mean that are relevant to what we're doing in the color page, That's going to be a huge boost to your confidence, especially if you're like setting up a project or dealing with a problem in a project. You want to feel like you understand all the stuff that's going on in here, because as I said at the beginning of this video, understanding tools is understanding software, and understanding tools is a key component to consistently crafting beautiful images.